Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Module 3, broadcasting nearly live from my home office, of course. Today we're talking about design methodology. And in terms of how I'm going to go over in terms of how you might outline your section and describe what kind of content you would find in there, why it's relevant, how it's used, and then you can follow that rationale to look for information in the textbook and in your literature review that will allow you to construct your method section. So we have three broad categories of methods, research methods: quantitative, qualitative, and hybrid. I will briefly discuss hybrid because it is a robust methodology, but I'm saving it to the end because it is more complex and time constraining than using either quantitative or qualitative by itself. So you'll understand the rationale at the end here, but I don't want to encourage you to do both unless you have to do a mixed methods unless you have a ton of time. So with regards to quantitative, the overall skeleton is to describe the participants, to describe the procedures or the way you're going to collect data, and third is going to be your data analysis section. So since I have suggested correlation to many of you relating to the looking at the impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable to validate your hypothesis, let's use that as an example. And as an example, I'm going to talk about amount of time studied, a relationship between how much time a kid studies and how high the test score is. And so your hypothesis may be that the more time a student spends studying, the higher the test score. And that's what you want to validate. So in the subjects, the participants, you want to describe your students. 30 students, their age, their grade, their demographic characteristics, male, female, gender, socioeconomic status, male and female or gender obviously, socioeconomic status, you might race, nationality, religion, any of the demographic factors that would help describe your overall sample. So typically what we're talking about in this kind of experiment would then be pull a sample out of your whole study group, whole population, as we talked about at the very beginning of the book, and let's say your sample is 30 students in your class among 100 students that are distributed among 3 third grade classes, let's say, because let's say we were doing a standardized exam. So that's describing the participants. Now, talking about the procedure, you would then describe your instrumentation, maybe doing a survey on that sample to describe how much time they spend studying. Collect from them where they study, how many hours they study, whether they study all the hours at the same time or whether they break it up. You might think of 10, 15 different questions on your survey that you potentially could make up or that you could get from your literature. So then you would then administer the test. You would get the test scores, which is hard data. You would describe the test conditions, anything along those lines that would give the reader an understanding of the type of test that's being administered. Time, whether it's timed, whether students can take breaks, or whether it's multiple choice, fill in the blank, essay, things along those lines. Whether it's a standardized test that the school uses, whatever the case may be. Then your data analysis. Like I said, you might be using a correlation, and in this type of example, and so you have a hypothesis that there is a significant degree of relationship, of correlation, between the amount of time a student studies and the outcome of their test, meaning that if they study a lot, they'll get a high grade. If they don't study much, they'll get a low grade. And so you're using a scale on a correlation between -1, 0, and +1, 0 meaning no correlation. That's your method of data analysis. So then you run the correlation, which you don't have to do, but you would run a correlation on the two data, the independent variable and the dependent variable, and come out with a number. You would interpret the number. Let's say the number was 0.53, and then you would say there is a significant amount of correlation between high study times, or a large amount of study times, and high scores. But that really doesn't tell you why. You can validate your hypothesis off that, but that's just using a number, saying, I was right, the correlation number is 0.53, it's significant, I validated my hypothesis, boom, under quantitative, it's all over. Now, when we're talking about qualitative, we are talking about a different methodology and a different approach to collecting data. For those of you that would prefer to stay away from dealing with a quantitative approach, then what you would be looking at is, again, having the same participants, meaning that the sample population would be exactly the same. And where then what would change would be your procedures. And for instance, you might then, under your procedures, instead of collecting surveys which describes the amount of study time, you might do interviews with the students. Interviews, for instance, where you record an interview, where you transcribe an interview, whatever the case may be. Then you interview the student and say, well, how did you prepare for this exam? How much time did you spend? How did you go about doing this? And so you have a transcription of that recording and then have multiple readers. This is a way of doing it, a way to do the data analysis. So your procedure would be to do the interview, then to do the data analysis on the interview, you would have maybe 3 different readers read the transcription that you would have, and you would propose some themes along the lines of, let's say, amount of time. Student describes amount of time as being high. And so you would have 3 different readers reading that, and then you triangulate those readers as a qualitative methodology and see if they all come up with the same conclusion, that when they read the interviews, that they all agree that this student said in a very emphatic way that the more time they put in, the better their scores, or they didn't put any time in for these reasons and their scores were poor, or they didn't put any time in and they got high scores, and because they got high scores, they were surprised, and maybe they have a rationale, like the test was too easy, or maybe they have a rationale for getting a low score even though they put in a lot of test time, which might be that the test was too hard. Now, with regard to summing that up and using qualitative and quantitative together, It's a powerful tool. It's a powerful methodology, and the reason it's a powerful methodology is because then the output score you get on the correlation shows that you are right. Your hypothesis has been validated because there is a significant correlation between the amount of time put in and the test score that was received. Likewise, I should say, the problem with that is it doesn't tell you why there's a relationship between the amount of time and the test score. Where doing an interview as a qualitative component, you might ask that question, why did you score so high? Why did the amount of study time relate to your score? And the student may say something along the lines of, well, all I had to do was memorize the formula, and the more time I worked on memorizing the formula, the easier it was to take the data that I was given on the test and come up with an answer. And I memorized all the formulas, and that's why I did well. So you see that there's a relationship there. We don't necessarily call it a correlation because you haven't done that and you can't do that qualitatively, but you can say there is a relationship, and my readers all agree there's a relationship. So you can validate that hypothesis, again, in two different manners, and one describes a numerical outcome, the other one describes why, and you have a much richer contextualized outcome. And so these two things together, again, provide a really useful tool. What I can say for this class, though, is if you have to write up two methodologies, it's going to take you so much longer and be a lot longer effort. So what I would recommend is for this assignment, writing up this methodology, that you just pick one of the two, quantitative or qualitative. Follow the guidelines that are set out in the book in order to do this. So pick some statistical test or pick some type of statistical analysis for your quantitative, and use some sort of qualitative approach that you find in the book. Likewise, if you want the literature to guide you, what I recommend is that you suggest doing a replication study. So when you see a quantitative or a qualitative study in your literature, you may say, I'm going to give credit where credit's due. The authors did this type of study. I'm going to do this design. This is the way the design is done. And you describe the design. You describe your participants, which may be your classroom or your clients. And then you describe the analytical procedure you would use, which is the same as the authors. And then you would describe in your discussion what your expected outcomes would be. And so you see how you replicate that, and you do the same thing with the qualitative. So that's really an easy approach for you to understand the process. And again, that's what I'm after here for you, is not to collect data and do an analysis. It's for you to understand the process, so when you read articles and you are critical of articles in the near future while you're working on papers for future classes, you understand how they're put together, and then you might be able to dissect them and understand that there's flaws in maybe the methodological approach that they use, and it doesn't match up to what their intended goal is. So that's what we have for today, and my presentation on how you might best approach this chapter and writing of your method section. Thank you for tuning in.